Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, hello everybody. A recording of this evening will be available on our YouTube channel later. I'm delighted to welcome my dear friend Karen Leggett Abouraya. Karen reviewed children's books for many years on ABC Radio in Washington, DC, and in the New York Times. She is the author of Hands Around the Library, Protecting Egypt's Treasured Books, and another book, Malala, Yousafzai, Warrior with Words. She is co-chair of the Friends of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina within the Baltimore-Luxor-Alexandria Sister Cities Committee. Before we start every evening, I usually like to give a short history of our website to newcomers. About 23 years ago, I wanted to pay tribute to the writers who have enriched my life. I created ArabWorldBooks.com, which is dedicated to enhance understanding between different cultures. We are proud that it has become a destination for researchers and centers of Arab studies around the globe. Our mission is to highlight the ideas, the books, and the women and men who create them. The core of this website has always been the author bios, their books, as well as the writing. Around the year 2001, we introduced two programs, the Writers' Workshop and the Book Club, both running now for 21 years. In the Book Club, we have featured a mixture of fiction and nonfiction, mainly recent books. Lately, we have been focusing on international literary masterpieces like the works of Albert Camus and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. We have also introduced a new series of conversations with Arab and international writers. Tonight is the 7th episode of this series. These conversations aim to explore the motivation process and outcomes of a writer's journey and shed light on the values and experiences that are common to writers and readers across the world. Egyptian author Mohammed Taufi will host and moderate the discussion. Thank you all for participating, and I wish you a very great evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome, Karen. I look forward to this discussion. We usually, as usual, we're going to have we're going to take about 90 minutes. We'll start with a discussion between myself and Karen for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then after that, we'll open up the discussion. Welcome, Karen. I usually start off by asking writers what motivates you to write. But I will also add to that, in your case, why did you choose writing for children in particular?
Well, first, let me say how delighted I am that you've selected me and invited me to this series. It's a fascinating series, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate. I've been surrounded by writing all my life. My father and my grandfather were both journalists. I wrote columns and lots of articles. My mother was an English teacher and a librarian, so it was sort of in my DNA that I would write. And I did become a journalist, for a radio broadcast journalist, for about 20 years. And it was during that time that I became focused on children's literature. And a lot of it, I didn't start out planning to be a children's writer or even a writer. I spoke recently to the Palestinian American poet Naomi Shihab Nye, and she said, life is tangents. And I think that's often the case. I've taken advantage of a lot of opportunities and tangents that have brought me to exactly where I am today, rather than having a career goal and climbing to a particular top of any ladder. So I was reviewing children's books on the radio. In fact, I had children reviewing the books. They called in and did reviews. And one time, we often talk about what was the most important book in your life. And for me, I suppose I would have to say it's a book by Eden Ross Lipson, who used to be the New York Times children's book editor. And she wrote The Parent's Guide to the Best Books for Children. And I had a news magazine on the radio at the time, and I invited her to speak about this book. And she came to Washington. We didn't do Zoom in those days. You came physically, and book tours were in person. And she came to the radio, and we talked about her book and how to choose books for children. And I had 2 young children at the time. And Eden and I hit it off perfectly. And very soon she was asking me to review children's books for the New York Times, which was a marvelous. And the very first one that I reviewed was Naomi Shihabnai's first novel, Habibi. And she asked me to review it because I had, I'm Egyptian by marriage, if you will. My husband is Egyptian, so I had some connections and understanding of Egyptian and Arabic culture. And I wrote that review and subsequently wrote many reviews, and then became part of the Children's Book Guild, which is a wonderful organization of children's authors and illustrators in Washington. And I became friends with the woman who illustrated my books, Susan L. Roth, and she wanted us to write a story together about Egypt. So we were looking for a long time, we were looking for what story would be perfect. And when she traveled to Egypt, she came to the library, the new library of Alexandria, and was just stunned by how beautiful it was and how much it had to offer. And she came home and said, Karen, we have to write the story of the library. So we did. We started with the ancient library and came all the way up to the new library. And while we were writing, the incident that is featured in the book happened, which was when protesters in Alexandria held hands literally around the great library in Egypt and protected it from vandals and thugs who were throwing things and who might have broken the great glass exterior. Well, the long story short, by the time it got to an editor, the editor wanted only that incident in the book. She didn't want the history of the ancient library. So we turned the book into the story, to a picture book of that marvelous event during the revolution. And we put all of the history and everything else in what's called the back matter and the pages at the back of the book. And that started my career in writing children's books. And it was well beyond, I was well after the age of 50 by the time we started writing that book, and then had an opportunity to write a picture book biography of Malala. And both books focus on young people, sometimes very young, making a difference in their society. And a lot of the tangents that I've taken since then have been related to helping young people understand and promoting the fact that young people are really making a difference in our world. So that's a long answer to why I keep writing, but I feel it's incredibly important to be writing for children.
Thank you. That's a fantastic way to start our conversation. I will get back to the 2 books you mentioned, because I think they merit a deeper discussion. But first, let me just ask you about your background in journalism and how that influences your writing. In other words, in journalism, you have a pragmatic language, a pragmatic use of language, plus an interest in facts. How do these 2 elements contribute to writing for children?
I'm sure it's why I chose to write nonfiction, because that's where I was experienced in writing nonfiction. Also, because I was writing for radio is very succinct. I had to tell stories in 40 seconds. That's not very many words. So, and a children's book has to really be very concise as well. And you have to pick words very carefully. People think that it's very easy to write children's books because they're short and they're full of pictures. It's really much more as difficult or much more difficult because you have to pick the words so carefully. And your words, you want your words to build an image in the child's mind and appeal to many senses and give them a feeling of excitement when they're reading it. And that's the same thing you do in radio, where people cannot see. I still love radio, and people can paint beautiful pictures with words without TikTok and Instagram and all the social media where we see everything. In radio, you hear and you create pictures in your own mind. So it was a natural progression, actually, moving from radio journalism and writing articles and the research. There's also, I don't think people are aware how much research goes into children's books, both fiction and nonfiction. And the research is just as rigorous. And knowing I used the internet a lot, I was not in Alexandria during the events in the book, and I have not met Malala. So I was using the internet, but I had to be very careful judging my sources. I had to make sure sources were corroborated. I had to make sure that they were legitimate sources. And I had readers afterward who were reading the manuscripts and checking to make sure that I had facts and culture and illustrations culturally sensitive and accurate.
That's fantastic. I mean, personally, I've always been fascinated by writers who are capable of writing good children's books, because as you said, this is there's so much to it. It's not a simple process. But in your case, you have an even more complex. You had an even more complex task, because you wrote the two books you mentioned, Hands Around the Library and Malala, are both laden with complexity. They're very sensitive issues, and they have political undertones, and these are complex subjects. How do American children, how do children in general, but in particular American children, handle these very complex subjects that also are not directly related to their lives? They come from different parts of the world. So first of all, how did you manage to write the books in a way that would be accessible to these children, and how did these children react, as far as you know?
I have had lots of opportunities to talk with school groups, do author visits to schools for both books. And usually it's 3rd to 5th graders. I've done younger children and older children, but they're really intended for those 8 to 12-year-olds, and who are really thinking on their own. And they're much more perceptive than we often give them credit for. And I don't delve completely into the politics. We certainly didn't talk a whole lot about, the various innuendos of the previous regime and exactly what people were looking for in the demonstrations. But we could certainly talk about the importance of libraries. And that's the way the book begins. And that's the way I talk about it with children. I ask them, why is your library important to you? What is important about the library? And many of them have a library in their school, or they have a community library. And we talk about why that's important, and why access to books and being able to read books and what you enjoy in a book, and why that's important to protect that. So on that level, they can certainly understand. My funniest story, the first time I talked with students about the book, it was 3rd graders. So these are the youngest. These are probably 8 and 9 years old. And at the end of reading the story to them, I asked, is there a building in your community that you would want to save if it were going to be threatened, if it were going to be damaged or closed or whatever? And there's this little boy waving his hand very vigorously in the back, and I called on him. He said, Chuck E. Cheese. Chuck E. Cheese is a fast food restaurant that serves pizza for kids' birthdays. And all the other kids, yeah, that's right. And I was sort of thinking, well, that wasn't exactly what I was thinking about. But we had a very interesting conversation. I asked the kids, okay, say Chuck E. Cheese is going to move out of your town. What are you going to do about it? And we had an excellent conversation about how you have to Can you do this all by yourself? No, you have to organize people. You have to talk to people, and you have to write letters to the management of Chuck E. Cheese and find out why they're leaving and what you can do to stop, and get a letter writing campaign going, and bring your signs and posters and have a protest. So it brought the whole notion of this demonstration on a far side of the world right into their community. And then they were, and I can also ask them when they have, many of them, particularly here in the Washington area, many children have participated in protests with their parents. They've gone down to our national mall, they've gone somewhere, whether it's a women's march, whatever it's been, they've participated, and they love to tell you about it. And many have also participated with their schools in campaigns to raise money for food during holiday time, or money for books. So they can tell you about times that they have participated in their community to help people in the community. So it's not that difficult to relate the ideas in Hands Around the Library to the lives of these children.
Just a quick background note. The book we're talking about is a factual, semi-factual description of an actual event that happened in 2011, in which during the uprising that happened in Egypt at the time, and some of the protests went violent, and some buildings were burned, and so many people came around to protect the Library of Alexandria, and they actually made a human fence or a human wall around the library to protect it. And I think that was the story. Now, an even more complex subject is the one included that would be dealt with Malala. That's probably an even more complex. How did you manage to deal with that one?
Well, that was complex primarily because it was violent, and it can be very difficult to tell a violent story that's aimed at children. But Malala was 9 years old when she began writing her blog for the BBC, and we talked about that. So she's the age of many of the children that we're talking to, and we're talking about schools. So when I ask children, what do you think what if the government said that only the boys could go to school and not the girls? And the children have an immediate visceral reaction to that. I mean, some kids think it would be great not to go to school, of course, but for the most part, when they think of being told they can't go to school, that's sort of a whole nother issue. And the notion that the girls in the class couldn't go, but the boys could go, that unfairness resonates with them completely. And we usually get into a conversation of what's fair and what's not fair. And that term fairness is something that children understand very, very young, what's fair and what's not. And then we do have to get around to telling the story of the shooting. And I'll hold up the picture of that page. I think the illustrator, Susan Roth, did an excellent job of showing that this was very serious, but you don't have, it's not terribly graphic in the way that where you would be stunned or shocked. And what she writes, and what I write to go with that, on October 9th, 2012, when Malala was riding a bus home from school, a man from the Taliban climbed aboard. He shot Malala and two of her friends. Her friends were able to recover in Pakistan, but Malala had been hurt more seriously. She had been shot on the side of her head. Malala was treated first at 2 different hospitals in Pakistan. Then she was taken to a hospital in Birmingham, England, that specializes in treating wounded soldiers. Malala's family and friends feared she might not live. But then we get to the next page. There's one page that's devoted to the horror of it. Miraculously, Malala recovered with no injury to her brain. And when she spoke at the United Nations in 2013, it was only 9 months after the shooting. So there is a recovery there. And interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, the children, when they're asking questions, they often do focus on the shooting. Why would someone shoot her? Why would someone do that? And we do have to get into that. Children want to know. I don't think we don't have to erase horrible things that happened or ignore them. We have to explain them and talk about them and get the children to talk about their feelings about them. And I think that's been very, very helpful and very useful. And of course, boys and girls also see that Malala not only survived, but continued to speak out and continues to this day. She's now 24 years old and she recently got married and she's still speaking out. So her activism has gone on for many, many years. And I think that's as impressive as anything to the children.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely fascinating. Now let's move on to something you mentioned earlier, namely since you're married to an Egyptian and you have acquired Egyptian citizenship. I imagine that you have, in a way, all your life, or all your married life, you have been engaged in a sort of cultural dialogue. You've been trying to bridge different cultures, and of course, there are differences between Egyptian and U.S. cultures. But also at a time when both Egyptian culture and US culture have their own inner dialogues and inner dynamics. So how does this experience, this intercultural, multicultural experience, influence your life, your outlook, and what are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, it certainly influenced the fact that my first book was about Egypt. It wouldn't have been about Egypt if I hadn't married an Egyptian. First, I fell in love with my husband, and then I fell in love with Egypt. And we've had a chance to go back many times. We haven't lived there, but we've gone back often with our children when our children were little, and more recently. And in a very active retirement, we also have both shared goals because we chair together as Imani said at the beginning, we chair the Baltimore-Luxor-Alexandria Sister City Committee, as well as the Friends of, now this is the Malala book, but the Friends of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina in Alexandria. And Tharwat now chairs the International Friends of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, which is an organization of countries supporting the library. So we work together promoting Egyptian culture, and that's been something he's always been very supportive of my books, but now we work together in sharing Egyptian culture, sometimes explaining it, and explaining, I mean, there's certainly, I think Americans have always had a very soft spot for Egypt and Egyptians. We learn about it in early childhood. We learn, unfortunately, all we learn about is pyramids and mummies, and as important as they are, one of the things I try to do is point out that there is a very modern Egypt, including the library, but Americans do have a love of that. And there is also a fondness for Anwar Sadat and the peace he signed with Israel. That will always be looked at very positively by Americans and puts Egypt on a different level from all other countries in the Middle East, I think. In Egypt, there is definitely more of a suspicion of the United States. And I think as much as I've traveled around the world, there are very few places I have traveled where Americans aren't distrusted, misunderstood, often legitimately, unfortunately. I find I'm often either need to be defensive or apologetic for the actions of my country. And that's certainly true in Egypt as well. Egyptians love Americans, but they always want to make that distinction between Americans and and the American government. And I suspect, I mean, when you were serving here, Mohammed, I mean, now you certainly discovered that yourself. You were constantly trying to explain Egypt to Americans, and then going back home and explaining Americans to Egypt. So there's a constant explanation. There's definitely there's a mistrust more than a dislike, I think, and that's more on the Egyptian side than the American side.
Okay, that's I mean, it's fair enough. I mean, I think people everywhere recognize that the foreign policy of governments is not identical to what individual people are doing or are trying to do. I think everyone recognizes that. But how do you think we can improve this? How do you think we can get Egyptians and Americans and different cultures really to understand each other better? I mean, does the technology help? Does the fact that we have these, the ability to communicate, is it really helping, or is it making it more difficult?
I do think it's helping. And in fact, one of the activities that we do through the Baltimore Sister Cities is to facilitate some conversations between children. And we usually do this with 4th or 5th graders. And we have a few, ironically, because of the pandemic, it sort of fell apart. But we have done this a number of times with children. And children are fascinated, both in Egypt and the United States, in seeing other children just like them in their schools, and talking about very ordinary things. One American boy asked a young girl in Egypt, "What's your favorite food?" She happened to be a young girl in hijab, so she looked a little bit different. And she was in the Egyptian library. And she said, "Pizza and hot dogs." And these American kids sat there and said, "How can that be?" You know, they immediately found a tie, and they started asking each other about favorite songs, favorite singers. One little boy said, "Who's your favorite professional wrestler?" And I thought that's going a little too far now. And yet there were the Egyptian boys, and they knew the same professional wrestlers as the American kids. So suddenly these people all the way over in Egypt didn't look all that much different and had all these similar interests. So I think it begins, and if it begins in 4th and 5th grade, then by the time they're in high school or college, maybe they want to do a study abroad. Maybe they want to travel to Egypt. It begins to set in their minds that there are more similarities than differences. So I think I think books do the same thing, but now that we can be online together, it's great. We have in Baltimore, at the Baltimore International Academy, we have an Arabic immersion program where children not of Arabic speaking backgrounds at all are having all of their classes in Arabic. So when we had their first conversation earlier this year, they spoke in Arabic to the children in Egypt, whose English is nearly always very good. But whoever hears American kids speaking Arabic, never. So that was almost to see the Egyptian kids reacting to hearing American children speak their language. So I think those kinds of things, we're hoping to do some more substantive conversations and get beyond wrestlers and TV stars, but it's a great beginning, and I do think that's the way to start. It's just to start with children, which is why I find children's books so important.
Yeah, that's an absolutely fantastic approach. Let me ask you a more general question that may also impact. We can also look at it from the children's angle. Is there a conflict between modernity and traditional values, or do you think that they can go together seamlessly?
No, I don't think they ever go together seamlessly in any country. I think there's always some friction. And whether you go back to the Industrial Revolution, you go back to the Crusades, and you come right up to our present day, there are people who are hanging on to a traditional order, and people who see the need to move beyond that, to broaden the sense of inclusion, to broaden, I mean, each level of society was broadening the numbers of people who could be included in the daily life of society. Whether it's workers and labor unions having a vote and having an opportunity, whether it's someone besides, whether there's sectarian violence, or now we have a much greater inclusion of people with disabilities, the LGBTQ communities. There will always be a friction with people who want to keep the society as it was. Whether it was when you were a child, when it was when you were growing up and things were different and things seemed simpler. But the world is always expanding. And I think there will always be a clash between the people who want to move into the next stage, whatever the next stage is. And some of us may be a little bit uncomfortable, but realize the need to move. And other people will always just fight it. I think there will always be somebody fighting against the broader inclusion of people in society and fighting to keep whatever was in the past.
Yeah, I guess that's how it has always been. Now you mentioned some of the difficult issues, but there are issues on which almost we almost everywhere in the world we see issues such as the widening social divide or the environment, that there's more or less a consensus on that. Although still you can see a lot of friction if you look at the details. What's your take on that? What's your position on these issues, and how can we tackle them as a global community?
I do think there's a similarity. I mean, we've all been forced together by the common experience of COVID. Suddenly, there's, no matter where you communicate with anyone, everyone there has some sort of COVID experience. And I think these other issues that you mentioned, the widening social divide, the environment, feminist issues, these are issues that encompass all people as well. At varying social levels. In fact, the Malala Fund, which obviously was created by Malala Yousafzai and now supports her, issued a report recently on the connection between climate change and girls' education, and pointing out that there's about 4 million girls who, because of climate change in the next few years, will not be able to continue their education in low and medium income countries. So there's a direct connection. And of course, the primary focus of the Malala Fund has been to promote girls' education. And they argue that by doing that, you will then get more girls educated, able to confront, able to deal with the risks of climate change, able to deal with mitigation and work and counter climate change in their own countries. And that so there's a linkage among a lot of these issues. And of course, girls' education is certainly de facto a feminist issue, but giving women more opportunities, more leadership opportunities, more opportunities to be educated will move us forward on so many planes. And I think that is a common issue. I think it's why women around the world are working together in lots of different forums and avenues, and online and offline and in books. Women seeking companionship and support for their ideas around the world. So I think they're important issues. And I think children's books can do a lot. There's a whole range of children's books now, particularly in this country, we call it STEM or STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and math. When you add the A, it's arts. And a lot of books focused on STEM and STEAM, particularly to get girls interested in these fields and to highlight how many women have been involved but haven't really received credit for it. So I think children's books can do a lot in this arena around the world. Hopefully get them translated. I would like to see a much more vigorous children's literature community in Egypt. and books in Arabic for children. And I had an interesting conversation. This is moving a little bit away from your question, but I would like to raise it as an issue. There was a conversation recently about children's literature in Egypt, and the fact that children's books are not read as often by parents of children when they put their children to bed, which is a very common thing in the United States. And it's perhaps because children's books are written in Fosa, in the modern standard Arabic, where that's not the language that families speak at home. So they end up reading a book that is not in the language of their home, and that may be that conflict may be part of the reason for not having quite as robust a children's literature community or use of children's literature. There's certainly some excellent books being written. I think they're just not used as much. But I would like to see that grow in Egypt, and certainly the use of books internationally, and more translations, so that we in the United States can read more books and see more books from other parts of the world, and not just American books.
I think that's an excellent point to launch our discussion with the participants. Your comments on children's books in Egypt, I think may produce some remarks or further points for discussion. But let me start with the chat, because I see some participants. Roba has already put in a comment on the chat. Okay, so she's asking you about if you actually have a chat with a child when you're researching for a new book, or if you actually interview them to look for subjects that are interesting to them.
Yes, I didn't interview children in advance of these books, but I ask them when I'm talking with school groups and children, what books they would like next, what subjects they would like to hear about. And I think a lot of authors do that, and often respond. I mentioned Naomi Shihab before, and she has a novel. She usually writes poetry, but she has a novel called The Turtle of Oman, which she wrote a few years ago. And it's about a boy in Oman who's very close with his grandfather, and his parents are going to study in Michigan. So the family has to move to Michigan. And the book is all about the loss that he's going to feel when he's not living in Oman with his grandfather. And the children in one North Carolina school were determined to have Naomi write a sequel. And they said, you've got to write what happens when he comes to Michigan. So in March of 2022, as a matter of fact, The Turtle of Michigan will be published. And that is a direct result of children speaking up and telling the author that that's what they wanted. We're actually going to have a conversation at one of our independent bookstores, and we hope it'll be an intergenerational conversation with children and adults doing some writing that Naomi's going to lead. But I certainly have always asked children what they want to read about. And I do think we really need to give children a lot of credit for I have a 4-year-old grandson who already knows exactly which books he wants to read when he comes over here. And he doesn't pick the simplest books. He often picks very complicated books. And he'll remember a lot from those books. And I think we really have to respect children and what they have to tell us.
Fantastic. Nahla?
Thank you very much. Good evening, Karen. I'm really enjoying this conversation a lot. I have a question for you regarding maybe this was touched on, like the difference between modern values and older ones, and how this reflects on children's book. I have a couple of young grandchildren, and sometimes I find it hard to tell them stories from the Arabian Nights, for instance. Like I have to make some adjustments and stuff like that, because I don't think, the message is always and a very positive one, or at least for our modern time. So what do you think about this issue? Like, what are we supposed to do with the classics that we have? And maybe in the Western civilization, it's Hans Christian Andersen's book or the Grimm's brothers books. I don't know, but like, how do we deal with this difference in values now in this modern time?
I think that's right. And when you look a lot of those children's stories, whether it's Grimm or Andersen or the Arabian Nights, those stories are very violent often. And,
Yes.
and you think, why am I telling my children this? And I think we can tell those stories and talk about them, talk about why that might be happening or why that story was written, or sort of get the child to ask questions and move beyond it and find out what interests the child in the story, and get the child talking more. And I think you can do that at almost any age. But you're right. There is, and there is I'm not sure that the traditional fairy tales are necessarily being read as much. Now, I don't know about Arabian Nights and how much that's being read to children in the Middle East now. I'm not sure a lot of the traditional fairy tales that we tell children in the West, Grimm and Andersen, I don't think they're all being told as often. I'm not sure my grandson would necessarily know those stories. I don't know. How have you modified the stories when you've been reading them?
I find myself sometimes actually modifying them instead of just saying them as is. But that's an interesting suggestion that you just made. Maybe just, because the other thing that I've noticed, like with my grandchildren, there is a huge difference between dealing with them and with my children, for instance. It's like a totally different generation that we have right now. They're much more, I don't know what to say, but like my children would have been very naive compared to them now. Like they're really much more aware of, the world around them and so many things. So maybe your suggestion is a more fruitful one. If I just tell them the story as is and ask them their opinion and how would they modify it so it becomes a better story that's suitable for our times. Maybe that's the right way to go. Yeah.
That's right. Have them give you a different ending. How would you end this differently so that people would be kinder to each other?
That's a great suggestion. Thank you for it. And if I may ask a second question, or I can wait for later.
Go ahead. I think we have
okay. Like you also touched on like on climate change, for instance, as a subject that's affecting everyone in this world, and like with someone like Greta Thunberg, like, and what she's doing and so on, it's actually became more and more children are aware of the subject and want to be involved with it. So again, how can children's literature actually like help find like a combined movement that can go across borders and across like different cultures and so on, actually to unite the voice of children, because they're the ones who are going to be affected the most by what's happening.
That's right. And there's certainly now there are children's biographies of Greta Thunberg and quite a few. In fact, there's even a board book called A is for Activism. And it's a whole alphabet with words about becoming active. And these are board books. So these are being written, intended to be read to children before they're, while they're toddlers, giving them this language. And I think it's great. It exposes them to ideas from the earliest time they're thinking about ideas, and letting them know that these are good opportunities, and showing them what other young people are doing, even very young people. There's an organization here called the Youth Activism Project, which trains teenagers in speaking out and speaking up. And one of their slogans is that there is no minimum age for leadership. And I have pointed out when I talk to children, we had a 9-year-old boy who stood on a stool at a city council meeting in one of our suburbs, and spoke in favor of lowering the voting age to 16 in his town. And there were several other children who did that, and the town approved that. So I think with children's books, we can point out what other children have done. And then the point is not just to read the book and put it away, but to engage the child in conversation, whatever the child wants to talk about. And you can do that, whether it's, I mean, we certainly look at ancient Egypt books with my grandson now, and he's fascinated by a lot of the pictures and has a lot of questions about the different gods and why one god has a dog on his head and another has a different head. So we talk about all that, and he remembers a lot. And we'll get into more advanced books as we go along, including opportunities for children to be helpful. I think you can find many ways to link a book. I wanted to, a new book that I've found that I hope to read with him shortly is called What is a Refugee? And this goes through exactly why families would need to leave their country, what it's like living in a refugee camp, what it's like when they move, how difficult it is for children to find a new home. But one of the things children can do, and this was started by a child, there is an organization started by a 9-year-old called Any Refugee. And children can write postcards and mail them to this central address. And those postcards are delivered to children refugees in refugee camps around the world. And it's a way to connect young children here in a very privileged community with children who don't have that kind of privilege. And there are a lot of avenues. The internet is wide open for finding opportunities like that. And you can nearly always find a children's book to go with an activity like that. And I think it's the way we can build little activists and build children who are willing to speak up for what they believe in, whether it's in their school or their neighborhood, maybe getting different food in the lunchroom. There's all kinds of things that it can start, or in that community where I spoke, they want to keep the Chuck E. Cheese, whatever it is that's important to them,
Right.
they can begin as young children.
Thank you very much, Karen. Oh, you're muted. We cannot hear you. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Let's listen to Kay first, then we'll go to the chat. We have a few comments on the chat. Go ahead, Kay, please. Kay, you're muted. If you can unmute.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. How long have we been doing this? Anyway, thank you so much for this interesting conversation. I also have a 5-year-old grandson and a 2.5-year-old, although he's a little bit out of this conversation right now. But something that occurred to me is that the 5-year-olds, the 4-year-olds, the quite young children do know about violence. I mean, after all, they watch these cartoons and video things, although the parents try to limit them. They see this sort of violence and they hear about it. But what they aren't able to do is make sense of it very well. Sometimes they can't even make sense of things that they know perfectly well. I just moved to Seattle, close to the grandchildren. And when I said I was going home a few days ago, the one child wanted to know, are you going home to Chicago, where I used to live? Because they just haven't put it all together. And I notice when I read to that child, if I explain something from some time ago, we're reading a story from 50 years ago, Flat Stanley or something, and I explain something in there that he is absolutely not going to understand, like old telephones or something. Sometimes he is open to hearing that explanation, and sometimes he's not, because he just wants to get the data so that he can then make sense of the world. To get all the input, and then he will try to sort it out. So I think your suggestion of reading things and then engaging about them is absolutely right on. The one other comment I wanted to make, I can't remember this as well as I would like, but I did see an announcement recently of a new project to write children's books in Masri, in Ammiya Masriya. And for exactly the reasons that Karen was saying, hoping that it would extend the use of the books with parents and children. And I don't remember much about it. It was a group that was just forming, and they were hoping for people to write these books. So Allahu A'lam, yani maybe this is the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, children are they're subjected to a lot of violence in the media, and then video games and so on. And even when in my generation, when we were children, I mean, just think of Tom and Jerry, the level of violence in Tom and Jerry. So it's not. I mean, this is really. I mean, it's just a different degree. What's your comment on that, Karen?
I think that's right, and I think that's why we need to engage children in it. I don't think, particularly, I mean, beyond a certain age, you don't want to expose very young children to a lot of this violence. And cartoon violence seems to be sort of in a different realm because it doesn't seem real. But I do think letting children see all parts of life, and then talking with them about it and getting them to talk about it. And if they don't want to talk about it, then you move on. At some point they will be ready to talk about it. You really need to take your cue from the children, and when they're ready to talk about things. We have a lot of, I don't know how much we have quite an effort now to censor books in our libraries and our schools. And there's a lot of discussion. It relates particularly to, to books about all the modern changes that we're talking about, whether they're books about sexuality or sexual preference or race. A lot of these books are suddenly on lists to be censored. And we in the literature community feel this is very dangerous, because if you can't close off children's minds, you need to let them read what they are ready to read and eager to read, and then talk with them about it. And if you disagree with something in the book, you can say that, you can explain that, but you can open up and talk. And as Kay said, sometimes a young child may not want to talk about it, then you move on and talk about whatever part of it they're interested in talking about and engage them. And then at least they know that there's someone they can come to talk about these things whenever they are interested. You always want to make yourself available as a conversation partner for children.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to some of the comments on the chat. Umayma asks a question about whether folk tales and writing for children is different from one culture to another, or whether there are common themes that all children's writing, that's common to all children's writing.
I think some are certainly unique to a particular culture, and yet there are some characters whose personality is similar across lines. In Egypt and many Middle Eastern countries, you have Goha, and we don't have Goha here, but we have other characters who play that role, who play the mischief maker, or the character who is good at heart but constantly gets in some ways. Curious George, the monkey, is in some ways like Goha. And we have other characters. So I do think there are some common themes. And if you look at the Cinderella story, that story is told in many different cultures, and it'll just be a slightly different version of the story, but in many cultures. So I do think there are some common themes across cultures. And I think that's worth, if a parent happens to know that, and certainly parents should we have so many mixed culture parents and families now that parents should be eagerly sharing all those cultures with their children, so that becomes a source of pride, not a source of humiliation or shame or something you don't want to talk about. That you've got all these stories in your background, and you can talk about all of them.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, Manuel has a question here. He says, has there ever been a children's book fair or festival in Egypt held every 5 years or so, showcasing this kind of literature? Is there scope for this in the near future? Alexandria's Bibliotheca would be a good venue for that.
That's certainly true. It's a good idea. Manuel actually is a longtime member of our sister city organization here in Maryland. So thank you for that comment and question. I know there's the Cairo Book Fair, which has been around forever, and I'm sure there is a children's book section at the Cairo Book Fair. And you may know that better than I, Mohammed or Amani. But I don't know whether there's ever been strictly a children's book festival. There are some awards, some Middle Eastern awards, some very noteworthy awards for children's literature. And they are getting more noticed, and there are more entries. And there was even a writing contest sponsored through the Bibliotheca Alexandrina for children, and lots of entries. So I think this is an interesting area. And I think the idea of a children's book festival, we certainly have plenty of them in the United States and overseas. I mean, Bologna has one of the biggest in the world, and Frankfurt has another that are pretty much solely devoted to children's books. And it would be a great idea to propose to the BA, to the Bibliotheca Alexandrina.
Well, we do have in Egypt. Go ahead, please, Manuel. Sorry.
I was just going to say, it could even be a book and film event where, for that matter, book, film, and maybe a few plays, theater. But I'm glad to learn that there is a hopefully long-lived book festival in Cairo, which is might make it easier for a children's a similar event for children's literature being launched.
Okay, well, this is a new idea. This idea of a book, children's book, and children's films in one festival. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Can I add something?
Yes, please, Asman, go ahead.
Yeah, the General Egyptian Book Organization had launched some simplified scientific, historical, philosophical book for children. Also, it is it's fascinating. Also, it is called العلوم المبسطة, or تبسيط الفلسفة, تبسيط العلوم, تبسيط التاريخ, and it is a small book.
Thank you for that, Asman. Also, we do have book festivals that are exclusively for children's books, and in the more general Outlook book festivals, there's always a very vibrant children's book section. The Bibliotheca, they have their yearly book fair, which is, I think, in July or August. And within that book fair, you have a strong children's books component. And it's one of the most popular, in all book fairs, it's one of the most popular venues. And you find many children and parents taking their children to get children's books. So actually in Egypt, you do have a very good market for children's books. Parents are very interested in getting books for their children. The issue, of course, that has been raised a couple of times regarding language. I don't know if there are many books written in colloquial Arabic, but even the books written in classical Arabic are written in a simplified form of classical Arabic that children are acquainted with, even if they're not yet school age. They will have listened to that on television, and it's not that. And the books are the grammatical, the way the grammar in the sentence is set up is intended to make it very close to colloquial. So there's a lot of interest in Egypt in in children's books. And I think publishers who publish children's books are generally more successful than general fiction publishers. They make more money, I would say.
That'll keep them in business.
Can I just add that there's actually an annual film festival for children's films under the auspices of the Supreme High Council of Egypt.
Okay. Is that in Cairo?
Yeah. Yes.
In Cairo. There's also, I would also point out the Sheikh Zayed Book Award announced their long lists for their 2021 awards. And for the first time, they've included young author and children's literature categories. And interestingly, for the young author categories, there were 881 entries. And for the children's literature category, there were 236 entries. So that's a big difference, but that means that there's a lot of literature out there that thinks it's good enough to compete for an award. So it's out there, we just need to, and we need to get it translated into English so that we can be reading it here in the United States, so that we can have that perspective and not just American authors.
Yeah, I mean, for example, one of the most famous writers in Egypt is Ahmed Khalid Taufi, and he's basically a writer who writes for young adults, and he's sort of a cult figure. So you do have interest in that area. There's certainly a lot of work to be done to improve the situation, but it's something that it's an area that in which there's a lot of activity going on in Egypt. Nahla, do you want to add something?
Yeah, if there are no other questions, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask Karen about, it was mentioned that you reviewed children's books. So I was wondering, what do you look in a children's book that would be different from, reviewing an adult book, or I mean, like a regular fiction book, so what are the special features that you look for in a children's book?
I think you want to make sure that it's going to that the message is understandable to children. So I look for the use of language. I want to make sure that the language is appropriate to the age that it's intended for, and the storyline. I would want to comment. Adult books can tend to go back and forth. Maybe it's they'll use multiple characters, and maybe each chapter will be a different character, or each chapter there'll be some time difference. And sometimes, and I would want to note that in a children's book, because for some children that can be difficult if you're changing perspectives or changing tense and time. So I also want to make sure that the ideas are, that I think the ideas are interesting, but also challenging to young people. In some ways, a well-written book is a well-written book, whether it's written for an adult or a child. So there is a certain amount of that where you're looking for the same thing. I felt more comfortable reviewing children's books because I read more of them with an eye to what made them good, partly as sort of mentor texts for my own writing. I would read very good books and say, what makes this good? And figure that out, and then want to put that into my own book. So I felt more confident reviewing children's books than I did, even though I read plenty of adult books. I felt more comfortable reviewing children's books. But in some ways, you're looking for the quality of writing, the originality of the story. If you're writing a middle grade novel about a teenager or a preteen who can't find herself, are you saying something different? Are you saying something different than the hundreds of books that have already been written? Tell me something new, or tell me a solution to a problem. Has a young person, there's a story written by an Egyptian, Khalid, and the story is a picture book called The Arabic Quilt, and it actually won an Arab American Book Award this year. And it's about a third grader who was in an American school and feeling a little left out, and finally she discovered a quilt that her grandmother had made her, And she showed this quilt for show and tell at her school. And the teacher really liked it. And the teacher asked for the child's mother to come to class and show all the children in school how to write their names in Arabic. And this was a story about how a school, and this actually happened to the author when she was growing up, and she turned it into a picture book. And so that was an example of a story that really helped that child find a solution. And any other child reading that story, even if they weren't a Muslim or an Arabic or an Egyptian immigrant, could find the same thing, could follow that path and could see themselves replicated in that story. And I think that's what I look for in a story. Can a reader see him or herself in that book and appreciate it?
And is there a balance that should be cut between how entertaining the book is and at the same time the moral message that should be in a book? Or
yes, there definitely has to be a balance. You don't want something that's entirely teaching. I mean, that's no child will sit in fact, I think some of the old books, if you look at Pilgrim's Progress, is an old series of books that was written in the 18th century for American children. And it's really, there's no excitement in the stories at all. It's really just teaching a lesson. And the lessons may be important, but they're not going to hold the interest of the child. And I don't think they held the interest of the child in the 18th century. They're certainly not going to hold the child's interest in the 21st century.
Right.
Yes, you definitely have to find that. And that's part of what makes an excellent book is where you can get a message across and you have something to engage a child in conversation with at the end of that book, but it's still entertaining. It's still fun.
Right. And if I might just comment on what was mentioned earlier about young adults and having some Arabic books actually simplified so they would be more suitable for them. I'm very happy to hear that actually Asmahan, I think, mentioned it because I wasn't aware that this was happening in Egypt because I've noticed like a well-known book like Sapiens has been now published in a comic formula. So to be more suitable for young adults. And this is, I find this a fantastic way to actually deliver this non-fiction scientific information to young adults. So I'm really happy to hear this is happening. Also, another project that I'm aware of, there's a writer called Ibram X. Kendi. He's an academic and a writer about racism. He released his book for adults, and then because I think one of his readers mentioned, he said, I wish I was younger when I read this book, so I would have changed a lot of my values. So he decided to have a children's book writer rewrite the book and make it suitable for young adults again, or for children. So these are actually fantastic ideas that I wish are really implemented in Arabic books too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And the person who wrote that was Jason Reynolds, who's one of our top young adult authors in the United States. And he rewrote Ibram Kendi's book for young people and put his own spin on it, if you will, but made the whole idea very approachable to young people. And he speaks, his books are outstanding and used around the world. And I would hope that some of them have been translated into Arabic.
I really hope so, because I read the book, the children's book version, and I just enjoyed. I wanted to read it before actually buying it for my grandchildren, and it was fantastic. And he has a great sense of humor too, which I really enjoyed.
He's very funny, yes. You can look him up on YouTube and watch him speak. He's a marvelous speaker, and he doesn't fit the traditional image of a young person's author. He's our national ambassador for young people's literature right now, and outstanding and worth listening to. So look up some, I'll put his name in the chat and you can look for him on YouTube, and your grandchildren would enjoy listening.
I'll do that. Thank you so much.
Ismahan?
Yes, I wonder, you said that the book built the mind of child and children and adults, and how such boxes effective or writing stories can help the girls which who prevented from going to school in Afghanistan nowadays after Taliban controls the country in that case. And what is the opinion of children in US and adults also about what happened in Afghanistan nowadays? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
An excellent question. I really haven't had a chance to speak to children. As I say, my questions have been more general about girls' education, and I haven't had much chance to be in schools at all since the arrival of the most recent arrival of the Taliban. Children are very touched by the inability of other children to go to school. As I say, I always find that. And the notion that girls can't do something that boys can, it is immediately strikes children as unfair. And I know the Malala Fund and a lot of the programs fighting for girls' education are doing what they can to certainly lobby. Every day on Twitter, Malala's father notes this is the 63rd day of no education for secondary school children, secondary school girls in Afghanistan. He counts that every day and puts it on Twitter. So he's constantly hammering away at that fact. And they're constantly drawing attention to the need for girls to get schooling in Afghanistan. It is certainly certainly the crisis of our, one of the many crises of the moment that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think girls' education is essential, not just from the fairness point of view, but also from the development point of view. Societies cannot develop with just boys getting an education. It's also very important from the demography point of view. Educated women have fewer children and are more keen to make sure that their children get a better education. And so it's a comprehensive issue. And I would say it's probably the most important issue everywhere. And if we want a healthier planet, we want healthier societies, we cannot neglect girls' education. So I think, let's see if we have any comments on, okay, so we have some interesting information on the chat. Now, I think we have a couple of minutes left. So let me be provocative. You have mentioned in answer to Umayma's question about the difference in culture and the common elements across cultures. But if we listen carefully to what your message is, your message is that children's books should be teaching children to be more activist and to be more vocal and to express themselves more clearly and more forcefully. And that's a very Western attitude. I think in many societies, including our patriarchal societies, it would be very rare if I can't imagine a single example of a children's book that does that. I think basically what you find is still, you know, children need to know their place and children need to listen to the grown-ups and so on. which is a completely different perspective. Personally, I agree with you completely, and I think we need to focus on that issue. We need to teach children to express themselves more than we do. Of course, they do express themselves anyway, but I mean, we need to encourage them to do that. So, any more comments about this issue?
Yeah,
I would point out about,
I think my yellow
I'm just going to
hand
point out,
hearing. That she was, just, I'll wait. Karen.
no, go ahead, Wallace.
Go ahead, Wallace.
No, I think the whole thing of this cultural stuff is so, it really requires a lot. Looking at children, and I don't know where to start. Fairy tales or even traditional stuff. I remember when I was working in the Black community in America, I was working with adolescent boys, and I had to do something, and I told them fairy tales. And they were so captivated by them because, of course, they know what violence is, they know what evil is, but what Karen said before, they know what good and bad is. And so it's kind of satisfying in the fairy tales that finally the bad guys, you know, get eliminated by some series of magical events. And I think I worked in educational publishing for a long time ago, and I'm sure it's changed. But what was striking to me then in America was how much control there was over material. So if you wanted to handle it, it would then be censored in many, many ways, explaining that children can't understand this, or the school board won't buy it, or this or that. And so for us to, as is often true, to think that we have a lot to show everybody else, we also have a lot which we have not faced ourselves. If I look at books, children's books in Italy, they're far less didactic. They're far less moralistic. They will not be talking right to activism all the time and the kind of current topic. But they speak to history, they speak to conflict, they speak to fear, they speak to imagination, they speak to beauty. And in all those things, there's such richness. And those things too, it seems to me, are where children can be taught to grow without being given a particular command, like to be an activist or that this is right. It isn't a complete sort of surprise to say that America, it was the Pilgrims who landed in America and the Puritans, and there is a moralistic side to America and then a dark side that doesn't come up in that shape. But I think I really loved listening to you. I think the whole opening up the topic is so important, and opening up the cross-cultural issues in these topics, not in just a small way, but really introducing whole cultural ideas of difference and putting them sort of side by side and letting the imagination sort of figure out the stories.
I think that's outstanding, Wallace, and I wish more of those Italian children's books were translated into English, because I think we need that variety of approach to some of these issues. And we don't want to be too didactic. We want to give children role models. And of course, that's what Malala is. And she was raising her voice in a very patriarchal society, as was her father. And he's written his own story, Let Her Fly. And that's about how he was countering. He recognized that the unfairness of that patriarchy in his own family, because he was educated and his sisters were not. And that began his journey to freeing his daughter. So I think if you present the stories of these people, you're right. I don't think we necessarily want to give children a prescription for now go out and do A, B, and C, but we want to give them the freedom to speak up and give them the space to speak up when they have something to say, and recognize them as valuable speakers.
Absolutely. But I think the more we can feed them also some ideas of not so black and white, not so clear, not so directed toward there's so many ways to become a person who will make a difference in the world. And I think it's not always just telling you that you're going to make a difference and you can and you should. I think beauty can help you make a difference, or so looking in so many directions. And so I think broadening as I said, I remember when I was working in that educational sector, the number of things that were simplified to a point where if a child actually accepted that simplification, we weren't doing them any favors. We were in some ways leading them to see the world in a way that wasn't, it wasn't that way. And instead, I think children's literature is beautiful. It can show you worlds that did exist, don't exist, should exist, but we should go for the imagination, as much as we can.
I think a lot of children's literature now addresses some of those problems with back matter. Back matter is much more extensive than it ever certainly was, even when my children were reading books. And that's where you can go into much longer explanations. In the Hands Around the Library book, that's where we show pictures of what really happened. We tell the history of the ancient library. And in the Malala book, we explain who the Taliban is, the history of Pakistan. So there's a lot of that extra information that it is now added to back matter. And I think that's because that gives both a teacher and a parent and a child a place to go for more information when they're interested.
Thank you. This has been a lovely discussion. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I think we've opened up a number of avenues that we can all explore and we can all think about. Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been enlightening for me as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's really bravo. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. It has been thank you for being in this discussion. It's been a fantastic experience for me.